When it comes to alternate versions of the Warhammer 40k universe, we're certainly not lacking in choice. We have the Dornian, Rebootian, Lionel, and Fulgrimian heresies, some of which I've already explored, as well as a few others like the Elder Gambit, Legions Astartes, and the Brotherhood of the Lost, just to name a few. Well, allow me to add to that already long list with an idea of my own. What if, following their scattering, the infant Primorks didn't find themselves among human cultures, but those of the Xenos? While many would have surely died early on, a few may well have survived, and maybe even thrived. So join me as I explore the question, what if Angron had been discovered by the Orks and grew to become the Prime-Ork Angrun, or Angrun for short. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, boot.dev. My background is in software development. I studied it at university and I spent 10 years working in the industry itself. And in all that time, one thing that I found was how hard it could be to find good resources to make learning something new both interesting and engaging. The folks at boot.dev believe that they have the solution for this, and that is to make sure you're never bored. Boot.dev is an online, self-paced learning platform where you will learn back-end web development from start to finish in the Python and Go programming languages. But the best part is, it feels like a captivating RPG game. If you're like me, you learn best from doing something rather than just reading or watching someone else do it. And that's why boot.dev has you actually writing the code yourself. And as you're churning out those lines, you'll be earning XP, levels, achievements, and completing quests to get to that top spot on the global leaderboard. If you're ever stuck on something, don't worry, because you will not only be able to find help on the boot.dev Discord community, but there is also Boots the Bear Wizard, who will lend a hand on your journey. He's an AI that's been trained on each lesson and will help to point you in the right direction with a series of questions. And you can always see the full solutions if you're still left scratching your head on a problem. If you're still not sure, then you can even try some of the early challenges and even review their videos and text guides in guest mode, completely free. But if you're really wanting to get the best out of boot.dev, then click the link in the description box below and use my code PeteTheWargamer to get 25% off your first payment for boot.dev. That's 25% off your first month or your first year, depending on the subscription that you choose. So whether you're just looking to try something new, or you're looking to make those first few steps on a whole new career path, boot.dev has you covered. Now, let's get back to building our Prime-Ork Angrun. I decided to build my Prime-Ork Angrun using his Demon Prince plastic kit as a basis. While the original version of Angron is only this size due to chaotic influences, my reasoning for the Prime-Ork version to be so large is due to long exposure to pure War energy. While not quite to this capacity, there have been hints of the Orc's strong beliefs causing effects in humans. Take for instance Commissar Yarrick, an old man, even by 40k standards, who is still able to wield a Stormbolter single-handedly, possibly due to the manifestation of the Orc's collective belief. However, while the size of the Demon Prince was correct, there were still a number of changes needed, such as the removal of the bestial hooves and subsequent replacement with Ghazkul's iron-shod boots. I achieved this by first sawing away the leg below the ankle, which left me with more of a human-looking leg. Next, I acquired the feet from the Ghazkul Thraka kit by also sawing them away from the Orc's legs. This left me with a few rough-cut pieces that needed to be cleaned up and trimmed back with my knife. Then, after a quick comparison, I continued to shave and adjust the foot and the leg until they were fitting together more snugly. From here, I continued to cut away more parts from Gaz with the intention of using them on Angron, specifically his knee pads. Again, these were sawn away from the legs and retained for use later on. With the hooved feet removed, the legs were slowly becoming less chaotic, but the trim across the armor panels was still a dead giveaway. So I set about removing these also. For this kind of work, I'd recommend removing the bulk of the trim with the shallow cuts of a knife before fully flattening out the surface with a combination of scraping and some fine grit sandpaper. After removing the side trims, I then assembled the leg and allowed it to fully dry before also removing that trim that ran across the top of the thigh. To attach my previously removed knee pads, I needed to first expand out the inside of the knee pads and also make Angron's knees a little narrower to allow them to actually fit. After playing around with my clippers and knife, I found it much more efficient to simply break out the Dremel and carefully cut back the plastic. As is always the case with these kind of adjustments, I'd highly recommend taking your time with this. Make small adjustments and frequent comparisons. That way you're not accidentally cutting away more than you need to. Once I was happy with the fit, the pad was glued to the leg along with the foot. Another part that I'd liberated from the Ghazghkull kit were his pistons. My plan to repurpose these saw me first drill a 2mm hole into the piston, glue a piece of 2mm plastic rod into it, and then drill a second hole into the leg itself. This allowed me to insert the rod into the leg while attaching the piston to the foot itself. This not only helped to bulk out the foot somewhat, but it did also allow me to better blend the new foot with the leg. With the first leg completed, I then repeated everything on the second leg before assembling the torso and gluing the legs to it. Now normally, Angron has a tail, but this made little sense for our Angron. However, I did need to remove a section of the tail in order to finish assembling the legs. So the tail was sawn away at the base. I then removed the small butt section and glued this into place. I was still left with a large gap, but this would be resolved later on. With the legs assembled, my next area of focus were Angron's back and shoulders. I began with the Angron back plate, but as I intended to mount Ghazghkull's backpack to it, it needed to be flattened out. I accomplished this with a combination of my saw and file. The saw was used to cut down through the raised disc, leaving behind a flatter surface that I then smoothed out with a file. The vents that sat lower on Angron's back also needed to be flattened out. For this, I used my Dremel once again to remove the raised details until the lower section lined up nicely with the upper panel. From here, I then removed the more organic, sweeping curves of the vents to make them look more mechanical and less chaotic. With both panels complete, I could glue them to Angron's back, remove the small nub at the base of Ghazghkull's power pack before also gluing this into place. Next, I could focus on the arms, and for this I decided to simply combine the upper halves of the Angron's arms with the bottom halves of Ghazghkull's, just swapped from left to right and vice versa. For the left arm, I sawed away the lower half of Angron's arm just below his elbow before I clipped away the metal struts that sat above the elbow plate of the gun arm. Both of these parts were then slowly adjusted until I could fit them together. As always, I made small cuts and regular comparisons until the two sections could be glued together and then to the torso. This same process was repeated on the right arm. I cut down Angron's arm at the elbow, removed the extra metal above the elbow on the claw arm, and trimmed everything down until they were both fitting together more snugly. However, due to me switching the hand that the claw sits on, I did need to reposition the blade of the claw. First, I clipped away the small pegs that would normally lock them into each other before gluing them together in a reversed order. Once I attached them to the fist, they were starting to look more like a right hand. The thumb claw proved a little more tricky though. So instead of switching where the thumb claw attached, I instead added it in line with the other claws. This left me with a 4-fingered claw rather than 3 fingers and a thumb. With the claw assembled, it too was attached to the torso. At this point in the build, I had all the limbs in place, but because I'd opted to not attach the usual wings and tail, my Prime-Ork was left with a few gaps which needed to be filled. This was achieved by first mixing up some milliput. Once I had mixed up a batch, it was pressed into the gaps in the shoulders. You don't need to be neat with this step because you're simply looking to build out the structure first. Speaking of structure, for areas such as the rear side, you may find it helpful to add some struts crafted from offcuts of sprue. These just gave me a little more resistance and support to the lumps of milliput. Once I'd filled in the gaps, the milliput was left to cure overnight. To create more detail in those filled in gaps, I then mixed up a batch of green stuff. This was laid across the shoulders where I'd used a combination of my metal and silicon tipped tools to sculpt in some rough musculature. If you'd like to know more about sculpting, I'd recommend checking out my recent sculpting video. For the seat of Angron's trousers, I first coated the whole area with a thin, even layer of green stuff before flattening out that bottom edge. To create the appearance of a seam in the trousers, I cut in a thin line down the center, followed by 3 perpendicular lines running across the seam. These would form the basis of the stitching, and I continued this effect by rolling out some very thin strands of green stuff, cutting them down, and then laying them across the lines. I then pressed down each end of the strand with a needlepoint tool to finish the effect of a stitch, and then repeated this twice more. And with that, the sculpting was complete and I could leave the putty to cure overnight. At this point in the build, my Prime-Ork was mostly there, at least structurally. There was still quite a lot of details to add. The first of these was some armor plating for around the waist. I first took a flat plate from the Orc Death Dread kit, removed the inside lip before supergluing it to its green stuffed derriere. The small gaps left on the belt were then filled in with a few plates taken from the flash kits. When it came to picking a head for this incarnation of Angron, I went through many different options. My problem was finding something that fit the scale of the model, was vaguely human, and had enough visible character in the facial features. After trying a few different options, I ultimately settled on the original Angron head, with a few adjustments of course. Using my knife and clippers, I very carefully removed and softened out the various ridges and spikes found on Angron's face. In addition to this, I also reduced the size and sharpness of the teeth. This helped me to keep a head that matched the model's scale, whilst also moving away slightly from the more chaotic theme. It also had the added bonus of creating a kind of human-orc hybrid effect too. To continue the orcification of the Angron model, I next began to add some of Ghazkul's armor plates. These worked surprisingly well without much adjustment. I simply removed some of the tufts of hair from the shoulders, glued the top plate between the shoulders, and then hooked the shoulder pads over the arms. Rather than using the gladiatorial tassets that came in the Angron kit, I instead trimmed down the bar and pegs from Gaz's loincloth before gluing it to the belt. My solution for the gap in the middle of the cloth was to trim down the skull that normally sits atop Ghazkul's armor and glued this to create the center of the belt. To give my Prime-Orc some armor across his chest, I took this armor piece from Gaz's kit and sawed away the section that would normally hook over the back of the neck. At this point, I also removed the extra armor plate and necklace. After a few trims to the rear side to allow it to better fit, I was finally able to glue the armor beneath my Angron's neck. I also decided to reuse the long spiked horns from Ghazkul kit as well. After removing them from their original parts, I flattened out a couple of the facets of the back armor panel to create some mounting points. This gave me a much better bond when gluing the horns in place. At this point, I continued to add various details to the model. These included extra armor plates taken from the Death Dread, flash kits and knob kits, as well as various cables sourced from both the Ghazkul and Angron kit, with a few of these needing to be trimmed down to better fit. For the base, I had a couple of options. Either the raised rock from the Angron half of the build, or the pile of rubble from Gaz's kit. Due to the adjustments, neither would work out right though, so I ultimately settled on the rubble pile. To allow the Angron legs to sit properly against the rubble, I did need to make a few trims, as well as drilling and pinning a hole into both the foot and fallen column. You may notice that I used a dab of paint to help me line up where I needed to add these holes. The rubble pile topper was then glued to an 80mm base. It made more sense from a gaming point of view to simply run this model as an alternate Ghazkul, as there were few alternatives for a model of this size, type and loadout. From here, I glued the claws to the feet whilst comparing them against the rubble before gluing Angron on top too, completing the build. Which meant that it was time to paint him, but not before I'd applied a layer of primer. I settled on a straightforward black primer for this. I intended to follow the goth paint scheme of black armor, and combined with all the metallics, the black primer would act as a good starting point. To make painting slightly easier, I started out by tackling the skin first. This sits in the recesses, which meant that I wouldn't accidentally overspill onto other areas whilst I was trying to reach the gaps to paint the skin. Rather than going for the usual red that this Angron model would be, I opted for more of a human skin tone and started out with a base coat of barred skin from the Tooth and Coat range. I applied this via my airbrush in order to speed up the application a bit, but this could have been applied with a regular brush too. In order to shade the recesses, I mixed some paladin flesh with a little water to create a translucent but not very watery mixture. This was then painted directly into the recesses of the muscles and blended out towards the raised points. To offer some contrast to the shadows, I next began the process of highlighting the skin. But before I applied any paint, I first mixed up some barred skin with some elven skin in a roughly 50-50 mix to create a lighter skin tone. The final step in painting the skin was to create an even lighter skin tone by mixing some ivory tusk into the elven skin. This was used as an extreme highlight, but I put it to good use, picking out all those facial details. With the skin complete, my next area to focus on were the metallics, and to paint all the steel areas, I began with a base coat of dwarven iron. As I applied this, I paid particular attention to not accidentally overspill onto my painted skin details. To give those metallic areas the appearance of grime and mild rust, I then applied a coat of battle mud wash across all the areas that I had painted with dwarven iron. This not only helped to darken down the recesses, but it also added to that weathered look. A look that was furthered by my application of some of the contrast paint Rattling Grime. Like with the targeted skin wash earlier, I directly applied this into a few of the deeper recesses or around points I'd expect more dirt and grime to accumulate. Over the top of this weathering, I then began both highlighting the edges of the silver areas and adding a few scratches across the surfaces. For both of these, I used some of the brighter silver of plate armor. I then continued work on the metallics by tackling some of the remaining brass details with a base coat of Overlord brass. This was also given a wash of battle mud, before I applied another highlight, this time with some glistening gold. In order to give the brass areas a little bit of a weathered appearance, some Kroxagore Scales contrast paint was painted directly into and around some of the recesses and rivets. Adding these streaks left me with the effect of a verdigris forming. Normally, Angron goes au naturel with his legwear. This works for a demonic prince, but even orcs are a little more civilized than that. So I opted to paint his legs using a base coat of ashen grey rather than his normal skin tone. I followed this up with an edge highlight of rodent grey, and then a final extreme highlight of cobalt grey. While this did leave me with something that looked a little like Angron was wearing yoga pants, I did feel a lot more comfortable than if I'd painted them with a flesh tone. To paint the leather straps around the leg armor, the ragged strips around the waist, and a few of the wrappings, I began with some cuirass leather. The reddish-brown leather effect was then continued with the highlight of boar hide. And finally, I added a few small dots of fur cloak to finish things off. While I intended to keep most of the armor black, I did want to break things up a bit and lean into that scavenged nature of the orcs by adding a few splashes of colour. The first of these saw me paint several panels with some Berserker red. Wash them with some Oblivion black, before I moved on to the highlights. First up was Sanguine Scarlet, which I followed with a few spots of Demon Red. Following the same idea, I applied some Dark Sun Yellow to a few more panels. I washed these with some Flesh Wash, and then highlighted them first with some Yellow Flame, along with some Craven Yellow, which was applied in a few small spots to just the corners. Once I'd finished off the more colourful armour panels, I turned my attention to the rest of the armour and pipework. These did need a little cleaning up after painting the skin and the metallics, so I hit all of these areas with some Doom Death Black. The armor's edges were then highlighted with Dungeon Stone Grey, and I finished things off with a few small points of Carcharodon Grey. For the bone-coloured details, such as the horns and the skulls, I started out with a base colour of Dust Bowl. In order to add some definition into those recesses, I then applied a wash of Archaic Sepia, before continuing on with my highlights using some Sandstone first, and then switching to Vampire Fang for the more extreme highlights. At this point, the bulk of the model was complete, which meant that I could turn my attention towards some of the extra details. The first of these were the embossed markings that I'd added across the model, along with the eyes, using some Carcharodon Grey. With these base coated, I then began work on the checkerboard patterns that are often seen across Orc miniatures. Whenever I approach the checked patterns, I start out by thinning my paint. You're looking for something which is a little less viscous, so that it easily flows off your brush. With the paint thinned, I then drew out a series of vertical and horizontal lines to create a grid pattern. These were then filled in with an alternating pattern to create that checkerboard effect. The grey was a good start, but I wanted to help these details to further stand out, and so I added some thin lines of white star around the edges of the squares and the embossed details. Considering the checkered ball pattern was painted by orcs, it's not entirely necessary to be completely neat at this stage. If you did make mistakes, you can easily remove some of those mistakes by painting over with a little more Doom Death Black. I also use this paint to very carefully dot the eyes. At this stage in the painting, I did feel quite odd about having built a model for the Orc faction without ever using green. So, to fix this, I decided to add a dash of paint across my Angron's left eye. For this, I used some emerald green and tried not to apply it too uniformly. By leaving a ragged edge and not painting directly into the recesses, it gave the effect of the paint being roughly applied. The raised points of the facial features were then picked out again using some ethereal green, leaving me with the Orc equivalent of Ziggy Stardust. And with that, I could finally start to work on the base. I'd already painted the metal details, but the concrete slabs still had to be tackled, so these were first base coated with Dungeon Stone Grey, washed with Battle Mud, with me then highlighting them using some Wizard Grey, and then even more Carcharodon Grey. To fill in the areas around the rubble and discarded metal sheets, I applied a liberal coat of texture paint, specifically AK Interactive's Dry Ground. I paid close attention during this stage to not overspill onto the painted areas, and once I'd covered the whole base, it was left to dry fully for several hours. While the texture was a good start, it did look a little flat, so I took some more sandstone, heavily thinned it out with water, and applied it like a wash. As it dried, it left a slightly darker colour in the more recessed parts of the textured surface. This left me with a little more definition and a slightly more realistic looking desert surface. From here, all I was left to do now was to give everything a coat of matte varnish to protect the paintwork and dull down some of the more glossy looking areas. And finally, I added a few desert tufts to the base, which left me with this. And here we have my completed Prime-Ork Angrun, and I have to say this has probably been one of my more favourite builds. While I'm certainly no stranger to custom Primarchs, building something that isn't just a Loyalist or a Chaos Traitor version has both been incredibly fun and immensely rewarding. Now I'm sure that there will be a few comments below that talk about how Orks would never allow a human to lead them, or mention the fact that I kept the cabling around his head, even though he wouldn't have the butcher's nails. But these kind of things are easily dealt with a bit of imagination. After crumping a few war bosses, I'm sure most Orks wouldn't worry that their boss is a human, especially if he led them into some good scraps. And I'm pretty sure that there will be plenty of pain boys willing to offer Angron some cybernetic enhancements. I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't allow yourself to be so tied down to the Warhammer lore that you just never have fun with your builds. Now I would love to expand this concept, so if you have any ideas for how the other Primarchs would have fared in this alternate universe, then let me know in the comments. Maybe a Magnus who was adopted by Eldar Exodites, a Perturabo who discovered a Catan shard, or maybe even a Horus who landed among a primitive Tau population. If you'd like to tackle this build for yourself, then you can find all the kits and paints I used to build him linked in the description below. And I also just want to quickly say that my Dead Animal Bits kit is now finally available for retail, so if you missed the Kickstarter, then you can pick up your kit over on the Wargames Atlantic web store. I'll include a link to them down below. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep this channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Dakota Guburi, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Lil Il Il, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Older Than Time, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Snowman53, Swedsman, Tim, and Warnovice. And my top channel members who are Axel Verne, Dave, Guy Bazant, John Gibbs, Kutch Cato, Mark Taylor, Nerdington Paints, Omni Tom, Phoenix's Den, Philip Poya, SO, That One Tech Priest, The City of Cryas, The Sire Acquired, Trooper Geo, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.